All right, guys, so welcome back to class. Today we're going to be covering the events that led up to the Civil War. And this is going to fit into the framework of our Westward expansion class because so many of the events that led up to the Civil War has to deal with territorial expansion and whether and how slavery would fit into that territorial expansion. So we're going to be covering a lot of topics. We got slavery, we got territorial expansion, and we got the coming Civil War. So a lot to balance, but we're going to get through it. It's going to be awesome. Cool. So our main idea for today that I kind of want you all to have a good grasp on, this is going to be the idea of Band-Aids versus doctors. So keep that in mind. We got a big problem in America today, or not today, back in the 18th century, and that is the problem of slavery. So we see this problem come up, Band-Aids versus doctors, while during the early 1800s, the United States government was making compromises over where slavery would be allowed in the United States as we expanded westward. However, they were not dealing with the real moral issue that slavery was horrible and wrong and should be abolished. So throughout the presentation, I'm going to ask you guys, is this event a Band-Aid over the problem of slavery, or was it a doctor? Are they actually fixing the issue, or are they just pushing the issue away and kind of trying to deal with it at a later time? So keep that in mind. The first issue and event that we're going to talk about today is the Missouri Compromise. So after we acquired all the territory in Louisiana Purchase, the big question was, will this new territory be a free or slave state? We had all this unorganized territory that we wanted to bring into the Union, and the first state that was kind of brought in was Missouri. Now, this came at a very crucial time in the Union because currently the Senate had an equal number of northern and southern states that were represented in the Senate. So Missouri being brought into the Union was going to shake things up a bit. It was either going to tip the scales in the free state or the slave state direction. This was going to be a big issue, and it caused a lot of conflict until one of the major players, Henry Clay, showed up and he said, I got to compromise, guys, I'm going to fix this. This gave him a nickname, the Great Compromiser. Okay, so keep that in mind. Henry Clay, the Great Compromiser. He came up with this idea for the 3630 line. So that's right here. And that's a latitude line that kind of just split the United States in half. And he basically said, look, everything below this line, that's going to be a slave state. Everything above it, that's going to be a free state. So that way, as we're dealing with new unorganized territory, we have a rule. As it comes in, this is how we're going to deal with it. Except for Missouri. Missouri is going to be admitted as a slave state for now, and then we're going to bring Maine in to kind of even the scales. So again, we got an equal number. We got Missouri for the slave states, and to balance it out, we got Maine. So as of now, everything is equal. Don, is this a Band-Aid or is it a doctor on the issue of slavery?
Definitely a bandage.
Right. How come?
Again, we're not dealing with the real moral question of whether or not to even have slavery in the first place.
Right. Yeah, we're just pushing it off.
Ain't no.
Yeah, exactly. Cool. Okay, so we pushed the conversation off again, but we're about to get new territories. This comes through the Mexican-American War. This was an aggressive war that the United States waged against Mexico, led by the President Polk. So he wanted to expand U.S. territory. That was one of his big MOs during his presidency. And by proxy, he was a Southern Democrat. So with this new territory, he wanted to expand slavery. So he came up with this idea that Mexico was going to attack the United States at some point, and he wanted to get ahead of the issue. So he started the Mexican-American War. This was a war that was that many big prolific figures kind of were like, I don't know if I agree with this. We got Ulysses S. Grant, who said he didn't agree with this war. We got Abraham Lincoln, who was a rising senator. After the war, because the United States was the stronger power, we won, and we signed the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo, which granted America a ton of new territory. We already had annexed Texas by this point, but we gained California, Utah, New Mexico, and a lot of Colorado too. But with new territory comes the same problem. What are we going to do with the issue of slavery? So that brings us to the Compromise of 1850. Will the new territory that came with the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo be slave or free? And the main issue comes with California. Bring us back to this slide. If you can imagine the 3630 line, it cuts California right in half. It doesn't work the same way like the other territories did, where we can just say everything above is slave or free. So Henry Clay, Ashley, what's his nickname?
The Great Compromiser.
Yeah, he comes in with the Great Compromise, the Compromise of 1850. He says California is going to be admitted as free, and to kind of keep the scales even, popular sovereignty, which the Southern Democrats really wanted, will be how we determine slavery in these new territories besides California. So that's 1 point for California, or that's 1 point for the free states, 1 point for the slave states. And then the free states also really didn't want slavery in DC. This was an uncomfortable thing because they didn't like having like an auction block right alongside the White House, like just a few blocks down the road. This was uncomfortable. We kind of wanted to shove that in the closet so that this wasn't something we had to think about. So we stopped having slavery in Washington, D.C. And again, 2 points for the free states, so we had to give the slave states one more. That came in the form of the Fugitive Slave Act, which we'll talk about in a second. For now, Kevin, Band-Aid or doctor?
I said Band-Aid.
How come?
Again, it doesn't address the actual issue, it sort of just bypasses it and makes compromises.
Yep. It's another compromise about where slavery is going to be, not whether or not we should have slavery. Okay, so we said that we were going to talk about the Fugitive Slave Act. This is one of the major shifts that happens that kind of raises tensions too. In 1793, there was already a law called the Fugitive Slave Clause, which loosely required states to return runaway fugitives from labor, which is like a nice way to say slaves without putting that into legal writing. But it wasn't heavily enforced, and this made the Southerners really frustrated. So the Fugitive Slave Act kind of eased those tensions by making it much harder for runaway slaves to actually stay free once they'd escaped. This meant that if you harbored runaway slaves, you could get up to 6 months in jail time. And also, the big kicker was kind of that judges no longer needed due process to decide if a runaway slave actually was a runaway slave. All they needed was the word of a white man to say, "This was my slave, he ran away, I need him back," and the judge could say that's true, and then you would be brought back to slavery, regardless of whether you were free or not. This was a big issue. So we can see too, Consuelo, if you want to read, just up to here, if you can you read that?
Yes. Caution, colored people of Boston, one and all, you are hereby respectfully cautioned and advised to avoid conversing with the watchmen and police officers of Boston. For since the recent order of the mayor and aldermen, they are empowered to act as kidnappers and slave catchers.
Yeah, and then right down here it says, keep a sharp lookout for kidnappers and have a top eye open. This was something that was really stressful to a lot of African Americans in the North now. Suddenly, like down here it says, a northern freeman enslaved by northern hands. Everyone around them was suddenly somebody who could bring them back into slavery. That brings us to the Kansas-Nebraska Act of 1854. This is when a Democratic senator, Stephen Douglas, proposed a new way to organize the Western Territory, again, that we'd gotten in the Louisiana Purchase, but then also Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo. A lot of it was just open land, and they wanted to bring it into the Union. Stephen Douglas had a specific incentive to do that. He had a train to build. He wanted to put a train right through this territory, and the way that he thought that he could do that best was if he got it settled, and then put a bill into law that brought Kansas, this new territory, and Nebraska, into the Union. Initially, when he tried to pass this bill, slavery wasn't even part of the issue, because which act right here would dictate that Kansas is a non-slave state. We just talked about it. Which compromise? The Missouri Compromise, yeah. So it would have already been decided this would be a free state, but Stephen Douglas knew that none of the Southerners were going to vote for this bill, so he had to give them some incentives to vote for it. And one of those incentives was to repeal the Missouri Compromise and make popular sovereignty determine slavery in these areas. So that brings us to, first actually, Consuelo, Band-Aid or doctor?
Band-Aid.
Because again, we're not dealing with the moral issue of slavery. So after this bill is passed, the Missouri Compromise is repealed, suddenly slavery is dictated by a popular vote. That brings us to Bleeding, Kansas, where settlers were racing into this new territory to settle it, and then many of them were just doing this to start a new life. But then also we had slews of people coming in from the North and South who had pro or anti-slavery agendas. They were trying to do this so that when the popular vote came, they could bring a new state and tip the scale in their favor so that the North or South would have more power in the Senate. So Southerners sending their young men, sending their slaves to occupy Kansas. The Northerners sending their young men and sending guns too to people who believed the same things as they did, believed that free states should, or that new states should be free. This is all the puzzle pieces for a battle and violence being built in Kansas. And on the day of the election, the tensions heightened further when Missouri sent border ruffians, that was their nickname. Missouri's the neighboring country. They sent them into Kansas to vote and skew the election illegally. This made slavery pass in Kansas and caused a ton of outrage across the United States. Battles broke out. 2 different governments formed, one pro-slavery, one anti-slavery, both within Kansas. This is never a good thing when you get 2 different warring governments. And eventually the pro-slavery supporters in Kansas broke into the capital of the anti-slavery government and burnt it down. It was violent, there was war, and this was the first dominoes that began to fall towards civil war. It was almost like a mini civil war had begun in the middle of the United States. You see, Kansas is just like the heartland of the U.S. It's just there, and this is a very logical place for the war to kind of break out and begin, just because it's in the middle of everything. So, that brings us to the Senate in